we've got three very interesting speakers for you. The first of the speakers really needs no introduction. Senator Sarah Hanson-Young has been perhaps the most prominent advocate for refugee rights in the political debate in this country, and has been consistently arguing for the rights of refugees. And would you please join me? We thank her for coming this time before Parliament sitting. Would you please join me in thanking her for doing so and welcome her to the platform?
Thank you very much, and I'm really quite honoured to be here tonight to be able to speak to you and to participate in an event organised by the Refugee Action Collective here. I know you've been doing great work over many, many years, and yet this is the first time, I think, formally I've been able to speak to you at an organised event. So I'm very happy to be here. And I've just come back from 3 weeks holidaying in Vietnam with my 6-year-old daughter. She thought that was great because she got 2 extra weeks off school holidays, and I thought it was great because I didn't have to read the front page of The Australian for 3 weeks, so that was very nice. And one thing about taking a break and leaving the country is you find some space for perspective. And I must say, the last 6 months, and in particular the election campaign, when you look at this issue, which I am very passionate about, it has been horrific. It has been horrendous, just the level of debate, particularly during the election campaign. And I must say, that day, or the evening of July 19, when Kevin Rudd, as the Prime Minister, announced the Labor Party new policy of shutting borders totally and sending all refugees and asylum seekers offshore to PNG, regardless of whether they were found to be genuine or not, women, children, unaccompanied minors, adults. That was a significant, heartbreaking moment for many people. And throughout the election campaign, over and over and over again, I had people coming up to me saying, I don't know what to do. I mean, where do you turn when you've got now almost bipartisanship on cruelty? And as I was sipping my cocktail, sitting on the beach in Vietnam, and watching people from all over the world gathering in this gorgeous spot, I was in Hoi An, which is in the central coast of Vietnam. I love it there, it's beautiful. One day when I retire, that's where I will spend a lot of my time. And I was looking at all of these people from all over the world who were there on holiday with their children, business people, all taking some time out and thinking, how on earth does Australia think we can isolate ourselves from the rest of the world when it comes to these issues? I was reading an article in the Guardian newspaper while I was overseas about the National Day of Mourning that was happening in Italy, where there was a National Day of Mourning and state funerals for the hundreds of people who died on the refugee boat that sunk off the coast there in Lampedusa. And the Prime Minister showed, despite the fact that this is a political debate in Europe, despite the fact that the EU continue to debate whether countries like Italy or elsewhere are doing enough to give people safer havens and safer journeys, despite the level of debate around what should be done and what could be done better, the debate itself is one that is carried with compassion and respect for those individuals involved. And the genuine caring nature of a nation who, even in the Prime Minister's own words when he visited the people who had survived, and he said, sorry, we didn't do enough. Even in his own words, knowing that despite the fact we don't have all the answers, treating people as human beings has to be at the focus of any political response to humans in need of help, protection, and basic humanity. And I was reading this newspaper and thinking, well, it was the same week where a boat sunk off the coast of Java just before I left Australia. And it was almost 48 hours after that boat sunk and people's bodies were being retrieved from the water, and survivors were talking to journalists in Java about their experiences. Almost 48 hours later, we finally had a response from the new Australian Immigration Minister, Scott Morrison. And there was no talk of sorrow. There was no talk of sadness that these people had had to take this dangerous journey and that it had ended in such disaster. There was definitely no suggestion of a national day of mourning or a state funeral. What different parallels, what different worlds was Australia operating in comparison to Italy and Europe? And as I've watched the debate around that, the sinking of that boat of African refugees off the Italy coast, I have been watching the desperation in the politicians' voices in the EU, saying we need a solution. There are the people who are talking about deterrence, and there are people saying, what about offering people a safer journey? It's the same debate that we have been having here in Australia for the last however many years. I got involved in politics because of the Tampa. As I know, probably many of you joined the Refugee Action Collective or have followed this issue since then. And the whole debate has been centred around the desperate idea, belief, obsession with deterring people from coming in the first place. When actually what we need to be doing is showing people a safer journey, a safer pathway, that where we can have an orderly process, let's put in place an orderly process. But let's remember that fleeing from persecution is always going to be, by its very nature, pretty disorderly. You don't rock up to the embassy and say, or the airport in the country that you want to leave and say, oh, by the way, can I have my passport? I know I haven't had one for the entire 40 years of my existence. My family don't have one, but could I have one, please, because your government is oppressing me and I'd like to fly out of here. Clearly that doesn't happen. It is, by its very nature, fleeing from persecution, a disorderly process. So we have to work with that and put in place ways to provide a human response, a compassionate response and a practical response. The thousands of refugees who are currently in immigration detention here in Australia, on the Australian mainland, on Christmas Island, there is around 10,000. We've got hundreds of people now being held on Manus Island and Nauru. It is costing the Australian taxpayer billions and billions of dollars. The latest count, and I want to be really clear about this because the Tony Abbott in opposition during the election campaign didn't put all of his costings in, so we don't know exactly how much his policy costs, but we do know how much the Labor Party's policy was costing. And we know that expanding the detention facilities on Manus Island and Nauru, which is what Tony Abbott has suggested, is going to cost even more. I did some costing analysis of it, and it was going to be at least $2 billion more. So with Labor's policy, which the Liberal Party have said they're going to keep $8 billion worth, give or take, with an extra $2 billion, that's $10 billion. You know how much the Afghan war has cost us? It was in the paper today, $8 billion. So $10 billion, and that's in the longest war Australia's ever been involved in, $10 billion to treat people without dignity, without respect, cruelty, this obsession that somehow we're going to deter people, rather than paying for a provision of services and ways of giving people hope, respect, and a safer journey. And that, of course, doesn't include any of the long-term impacts on people's lives once they come from detention, because we know the majority of people who take that dangerous boat journey when they get to Australia, whether they're sent to Manus Island, Nauru, or processed here, their claim processed here in Australia, that they end up being found to be genuine refugees. So the long-term cost is obviously much, much more. And I don't know, maybe somebody here at the university could do some economic impact assessment of the long-term statistics. I can tell you, Treasury doesn't want us to think about that at all. You know, there are good people in Australia who care desperately about how we treat refugees and asylum seekers, and there are people across all parties who feel like that. But the problem is this debate has become so poisoned. The fear, the myths, the lies, the pretense that there is a crisis has meant that those people have very, very limited space within their own parties, and I believe also publicly within the various media outlets. The media, generally speaking, will follow the line of the government on if there is a crisis or not. We've seen it over the last 3 or 4 years. Apparently we have a crisis. We do have a crisis, but it's not a crisis of border protection. It's not a national crisis. It's a humanitarian crisis, and it's time it started being treated like that by politicians, but also reported as such by the media. I just want to go back to the Italy response. After the sinking of that boat, the Prime Minister went to the island the boat sunk off, visited the survivors of the tragedy, and he said to them, "I apologise for the inadequacies of our own country in relation to a tragedy like this." I shudder at the idea of how many apologies we are going to have to make to the children who we've put locked up in immigration detention. I shudder at the idea of ever having to ask for the apology to be accepted by children whose parents have been so traumatised throughout this journey that they are no longer able to care for their children. That is exactly what is happening today. It's what happened during the Howard years when we locked children up on Nauru and Manus Island, and it is happening again. We can't argue that we don't know the facts. We can't argue that deterrence policies work, because they don't. We've seen that. Boats keep coming. The United Nations yesterday launched new statistics that showed there are more people seeking refuge and more refugees in the entire world than ever before, higher than 1994. So in 20 years, we currently have the highest level of refugees worldwide. No amount of callous policies are going to make that issue go away. People will continue to take desperate actions. And even though we've seen some numbers that suggest there is a decline in boat arrivals currently, that doesn't mean those people have gone away. There is a gap and a backlog of people in Indonesia, for example. 10,000 people have been assessed, and they're sitting in Indonesia with no hope of resettlement because, as John mentioned, we don't take enough people. We don't resettle them. So they sit there and sit there and sit there until they have no other option. And coming by boat sounds like a pretty good one in comparison. In Indonesia, a refugee family, your kids can't go to school. You can't access the normal medical facilities. You can't just go to the doctor. You can hardly just go to the hospital or the emergency room. You can't work. You're constantly moving if you're not in a supported environment by the UNHCR, and that doesn't last very long anyway. And even if you don't get resettled within 3 years in Indonesia or Malaysia, you have to reapply for an assessment. So you apply to be assessed. That takes 12 months. You then get your assessment. That might take another 12 months or 3 or 4 years. And if you don't get resettled by a third country in that time, within 3 years, you have to start the process all over again. We've got to fix that. There is a solution here. Tony Abbott's temporary protection visas isn't it. Locking up people on Manus Island and Nauru isn't it. Putting in place processes to deal with the numbers of people in our region who need protection, boosting assessment facilities and avenues for assessment in places like Indonesia, Malaysia, the Pakistan-Afghan border, would be a good way of at least putting some blocks in where people could actually get some hope. Increasing our humanitarian intake. We've assessed all these people in Indonesia with the helping the United Nations do that. Say Australia is going to take more of them. Ask other countries then to take more as well. It's exactly what happened after the Vietnam War under Malcolm Fraser. And I know, I was a small child, but I've read enough and I've talked to enough people to know that that process wasn't perfect. There were people who languished in some of those places for years. Let's learn from those mistakes and let's actually build on something that fixed. At least people were given hope. And how much better has our country been for having welcomed those dozens, tens of thousands of refugees here to our country? I am quite concerned at where this debate has gotten in Australia. I feel gutted that we just saw an election campaign effectively won off the back again on treating people terribly. People say to me, Sarah, why on earth did you get involved in politics? You know, what difference have you made in the last 6 years when this is one of my key issues and platforms? And the only answer I have to that is that basic values of decency, humanity, a fair go, that have made our country great, deserve a voice. And they deserve a voice from the community. They deserve a voice from our political leaders. And if we don't put a stake in the sand, we can see how fast we move very quickly when politicians want to trick us otherwise. I'm really disappointed, heartbroken at Labor's response during the election campaign. And I don't think any amount of soul searching now and apologising in the short term is going to fix that. They made a terrible mistake and they need to be called out on that. But we now need to pull those good-hearted, fair-minded people together because we have a bigger battle on our hands now. Tony Abbott is making no mistake about it. He is going to run this issue down to be able to treat people as appallingly as possible and not tell anybody about it. His ludicrous, ridiculous, secret briefings to the media once a week, where he doesn't answer the questions of journalists, where he won't give the figures of people arriving, where he won't tell people, yes, okay, it might get it off the front page of the paper, but I think Australians actually have a right to know that $10 billion of our money is being spent treating people appallingly. And I'm really concerned of what this means for those children in particular. We've talked about the various generational mistakes that we've made to children. I fear that this is going to be the next one. These children are the next damaged generation. And the Prime Minister of Italy can apologise to the survivors of one boat sinking. And it's time that we started apologising to the children that we have not been treating properly. 10 years ago, under John Howard, and those children who were locked up in immigration detention today. There is, I don't believe, any solution that Australia can do on its own, but there are solutions to the issues that every day pop up in this space. But it takes an ability for Australia to think outside our own borders, that we have to be part of our region. We cannot isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. And when there are more people seeking refuge than since 1994, in the last 20 years, no amount of sanitised media briefings by the Immigration Minister to the Australian press is going to make those people's lives safer or stop refugees from trying to reach our country. They're not trying to breach our borders, they're trying to invoke the protection of our borders. The terms such as illegal, Scott Morrison's issued a directive that people should be referred to as illegal maritime arrivals. You've got to remember where the refugees first started being called illegals. It was in the 1930s when Jewish refugees were fleeing Germany and trying to get to Palestine, and it was the British who started labelling them as illegal migrants. It is not illegal to seek asylum in a country that signed the convention, and it is not the wrong thing to do to try and save the future of your family and your children. And our country has been built on an amazing footing of migration and understanding compassion from our Indigenous people to allow us all to share this wonderful land. And yet, the whole notion of a fair go and our national identity is being stripped away while we continue to build fear around a small, relatively small number of people who come to our country asking for our help. I really want to hear what the other speakers have to say and I'd love to take questions, so I'll respond in detail to any of those during the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
That's Sarah. The next speaker is Professor Desmond Manderson. Desmond is a future fellow in the College of Law and the Research School of Humanities and the Arts here at the ANU. A future fellowship is a pretty rare academic distinction, so this is a very distinguished academic position that he's coming from. He came to our notice in particular with an article that he wrote in the Canberra Times a little while ago that seemed to some of us to sum up exactly what we also thought. So we invited him to speak.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks very much for organising the event. And thanks too to Senator Hanson-Young, who really, I think, summed up a lot of the, the pain that we feel and the injustices that we see all around us in relation to this issue. And of course, the problem is that sentiment of injustice doesn't seem to be very widely shared in Australian society at the moment. And I always feel that, sensibilities about human rights run fairly thin in Australian society. My feeling in a way is that Australian people are often tolerant but not entirely generous, and that's one of the things that we're seeing here. So the question really is about debate. The question is about how we can reframe the debate to allow people's better instincts and better knowledge to prevail as opposed to their fears and in fact their desire for ignorance. And I just want to say a couple of things in this talk about how we might go about framing that debate in a new way, in the hope that you might be able to take some of those ideas and use them yourselves and elaborate on them in discussions that you have with the people around you in your classes, around the kitchen table or whatever. Because, the thing that really makes me mad is actually not cruelty and immorality, it's stupidity. And the fundamental point about what's wrong with Abbott's refugee policy is it's stupid. It's stupid because it won't work. And I'm going to say a little bit about why it just won't work. But see, the thing is that it's always characterised as the woolly-headed idealists versus the hard-headed pragmatists. And I agree with that entirely, except we've got the hats on the wrong people. It's the Abbott policy, which is woolly-headed idealism, which attempts to create a fantasy of a world in which the boats will just stop coming and the problem will just go away, and develops policies that represent this fantasy. And it's the people on the other side, people like Sarah, who express pragmatism, a recognition that the problem won't go away. We have to deal with people who are suffering in our region and who will try and get to our shores, come what may, in all sorts of different kinds of ways. So they're the realists. And the fantasists are people like Tony Abbott. Now, it's interesting because Tony Abbott was, for 5 years under John Howard, Minister for Health. And in that capacity, he was head of the Tough on Drugs campaign. And he saw through to a fairly sort of, failed policy of zero tolerance under John Howard. And my point is simply this. The asylum problem is like the drug problem. You can believe in zero tolerance. You can believe that we should just say no, that we should lock them all up, and that will somehow do any good. But we know from experience that zero tolerance in relationship to drugs simply doesn't work. In fact, more than doesn't work, it actually makes the problem worse. Now, the reason it doesn't work, as Senator Hanson-Young has already said, is that there are too many forces in the region driving people out of their countries, into transit countries, and eventually to Australia for any policies of ours to make more than a small amount of difference. In a place like Malaysia, for example, there are over 200,000 refugees, displaced persons and forced migrants. And those people, suffer under enormously difficult conditions and, unsurprisingly, are looking for a better haven. They're looking for a way out, as are people in Indonesia, as well as people from source countries like Sri Lanka or Syria or Afghanistan and so on. So, meanwhile, the UNHCR process has basically broken down in those places. Only 10% of refugees are even processed in any 1 year, and only 1% of those are settled. So, in other words, the queue, such as it is 1,000 years long. And not surprising, really the word queue is another one of those debate terms that drives me spare, because it's not a queue. We ought to call it a lottery. And not surprisingly, a lot of people have decided that they would rather not play this lottery and just wait for their lucky numbers to come up. But the drug model and the idea of zero tolerance, I think, is very helpful for us. Because if we've learnt anything about drug policy over the last 100 years, it is that zero tolerance is a completely bankrupt system that not only fails to stop the drug problems, of however we see that, but actually makes the problems worse. For similar kinds of reasons, because the demand pressures are too strong, and because what you do when you create very severe deterrent strategies is you simply increase the risks of criminal behaviour. You simply make it more profitable for traffickers and smugglers. You make it more worth their while because you've put up the price, you've made it more risky for them, and so you get more violence in society, more trafficking, and then in relation to drugs, as we know, you get more people dying. You get people dying not because the drugs are killing them, but because the legal system is killing them. The classic example of prohibition is that thing that we call prohibition. In the US, in the 30s, in the 20s, they tried prohibition, and it was a catastrophe. And as we know, it led to great gangster movies, but that's about it. Other than that, it led to an increase in corruption, an increase in violence, an increase in crime, more deaths, and more drugs. So, it was a lose-lose situation. And we're still seeing that. In North America, whole cities have been ruined, not by drugs, but by drug policies. In Central America, whole countries are being ruined by those same policies. In a place like Mexico, where we've seen 30,000 deaths from drug-related cartels over the last few years, we've seen examples of the way this problem continues to completely gut communities and destroy societies. And the same sorts of patterns can be seen in relation to asylum-seeking issues. The same examples over and over again of counterproductive policy. So let me just give you a few examples of how, not just how wrong or how cruel, but how counterproductive, how stupid our policies are. You take an example like family reunion policies, where in around about 2000, John Howard changed the laws and said, we're not going to allow people who come as refugees to bring out their families in later years. That way, we'll stop them coming out, single men coming out as stalking horses and bringing their families later. And he's right, that did stop happening. What happened was people brought their whole families on the boats instead. So that we didn't actually stop any refugees from coming to Australia. What we did was change the composition of those refugees so that they were a great larger percentage were women and children. And if you look at the CVEX disaster, in which over 350 people died, over 3/4 of those people were children and women, a direct result of our family reunion policies. And we've seen that policy reintroduced over the last couple of years. We've similarly seen an increase in the number of women and children on boats, and then papers like The Australian wring their hands and say, you know, littlest victim of Australian asylum policy, with a picture of a child's coffin, without acknowledging that it's because of our policies that those children were on the boats in the first place. Or we could look at the no-work policies, for example, the temporary protection visas. And again, there's this what I call legal magical realism that assumes that if you pass a law that says something, then it will happen. In 1905, we passed a law and it said no one will smoke opium. Worked well, hey? I mean, talk about wishful thinking. So we have a law that says no people on temporary protection visas are able to work. And then we have this fantasy that means they won't work. But of course they'll work. They're being given such a pittance from the government. What choice do they have? What will change is the conditions under which they will work. They'll work illegally, they'll work under the counter, they'll work on the margins of society, they'll take jobs and conditions away from Australian workers, they'll undercut working conditions, we'll create criminalised communities and ghettos in our inner cities, and then in 5 years' time, whoever's the Minister for Immigration will wring their hands again and say, isn't it terrible how criminal the refugees are? And it will be the same thing. It will be our own criminal laws, our criminal policies, which cause these consequences, these unintended consequences. Similarly, in relation to people smuggling, as I've said, the drug trafficking model shows us that making tough laws against smuggling or trafficking doesn't stop it happen. It just changes the conditions under which it's happened, and so it becomes more dangerous. And we've seen that in the last few months. We've seen more inexperienced crews take to the sea, and more avoidable deaths in those circumstances. And of course, I think the most important example of a pointless and counterproductive policy is mandatory detention itself, which there is no evidence that it has stopped any asylum seekers coming to Australia at huge cost and at huge emotional, psychological and physical damage to the people who are doing there. And even the Secretary of the Department of Immigration has acknowledged that there is zero evidence that mandatory detention has had any useful effect at all, other than being a useful sort of rhetorical tool for politicians. So again, we see the same kinds of patterns of naive legal magical realism, counterproductive policies and unintended consequences being replayed in relation to asylum, as we have already seen over a long period of time in relation to drugs. Now, that's not a happy story, but I think there is another message here, and it's not just a message of how stupid we are, although, that is part of the message. The message is also that something has changed in Australia in relation to drugs over the past 10 years. There has been an increased attention to what are called harm reduction policies. And harm reduction policies don't have the sort of element of fantasy that we can just stop people taking drugs. Instead, they try and change the conditions under which people use drugs and support them and try and improve their life options and their life choices. So that in a number of states and territories in Australia, cannabis has been decriminalised. In most of the other states, there are very large cannabis cautionary schemes that take a lot of what would have been, young people in particular going through the court system, out of the court system, and protected them from the stigma of a criminal conviction and so forth. And those policies have had a really significant effect on the legal system as ability to manage the drug problem. Those have been very successful policies. And similarly, the needle exchange programs have been enormously successful, not at stopping people using drugs, but at stopping people dying from using drugs. And Australia has led the world in harm reduction strategies over the last 10 years. Needle exchange programs are a model that are used all around the world, and Australia has been incredibly successful and by some estimates saved many thousands of lives, particularly in relation to AIDS, by quick acting, by developing these programs, and as I say, by recognising that you can't simply just pass a law and stop people from taking drugs. So if the question is about framing, here we have an example of, I think, what has been, to some extent, quite a successful reframing. And I think if you think about the way in which drug policies were spoken about 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, you can see that a lot of the rhetoric, not all the rhetoric, but a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of that heat has gone out of the drug debate. And a lot of the extremist statements that we were used to even 10 years ago, when John Howard's advisor on drugs said, addiction is an example of something which is a fate worse than death. And that was his, lead advisor on drug policy saying those sorts of things, where he pushed this kind of line that we should just say no and so forth. Those sorts of things, that sort of language is, I think, less and less credible in Australian society. And while it's a slow battle, my feeling is, and you only have to look recently, moves by the New South Wales Parliament to allow medical marijuana, laws passed in California and Oregon and Washington and America, for God's sake, that have made big changes in the treatment of cannabis over there, show that prohibition, I think, is losing the war they started and the war they invented in relation to drugs. So the question is, what would a harm reduction policy in relation to asylum seekers look like, and how can we get there? Well, I think we've heard a lot of what it would look like, what a process which was realistic and pragmatic rather than fantastic and naive would look like. We would get rid of those counterproductive policies that do nothing and in fact make the problem worse, like mandatory detention, like no work policies, like family reunion policies. We would realise that in fact, again, from a pragmatic rather than just a moral point of view, we have more to gain than to lose by adopting best practices. Because if we develop race for the bottom strategies, which is what we're doing now, trying to make conditions as bad as possible in places like Manus Island, for example, we simply give open slather to other countries to do the same. And that makes a much worse condition for asylum seekers in a place like Malaysia, which will eventually drive them to other places like Australia. So we're in fact just storing up a problem for the future by our current narrow kind of focus on these kinds of things. So once we recognise that in fact we gain more than we lose by adopting humanitarian policies, that it actually works better, and that's what we've learned about drugs. Harm reduction policies actually work better than zero tolerance policies. We would then be working on resettlement policy. We would increase support for UNHCR. The amount of money we've been giving to that has been decreasing over the last couple of years rather than going up. We would develop our own ability to handle regional resettlement and so on. All of these things would recognise the ways in which we can be part of a regional solution, in which we try not simply to stop the boats, but to address the conditions that lead to the boats and the conditions of people on the boats and in those kinds of places. Now the question is, how do we make that happen? How do we change that debate? And again, I think that the drug analogy is helpful, because I think there are a lot of people in this community, and not just the people in this room, whose attitudes of drugs have changed over the last 10 years. And they can see that change in their own lives. Why have they changed? Why have a lot of people, people not particularly radical, changed their attitudes about these things? One, which I think Sarah has pointed out very strongly, is the economic cost of the process became pretty much unsupportable in relation to drugs. The amount of money that we were just flushing down the toilet in pursuit of this useless policy has become very clear to people, and that's clearly the case here too. The other problem, which I think, the other thing that happened was what I call normalisation, which is simply the fact that when it came to drugs in the 80s and 90s, a lot of people had much more personal experience with people in those situations. Not just as villains, not just as people locked up, but as their children, as their brothers and sisters, as their co-workers, as their friends. And the more they saw about the realities of those lives, the more they realised that the language of zero tolerance didn't actually mesh with that experience and those problems. And here I think we do still have a problem, which is that the government, both the previous government and this government, is making increasing efforts to get the problem not solved but invisible. Push it off shore, hide it behind razor wire, have less briefings, less information, less publicity, and in all of those ways, the very things we need to get a connection to the people in these situations and to the consequences that they're facing are being taken away from us. So that, to me, I think is the problem. There is a way of reframing the debate, and I think a move from zero tolerance to harm reduction is one helpful way of thinking about how we might articulate that kind of change. But then we need to know more. We need to have more information, more images, more communication about these things. We have to demand that we know what goes on in our name in order to set in place the processes which will, I hope, allow it to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Desmond. The third and final speaker before we have questions and discussion tonight is Karen Maric. Now, Karen is neither a politician nor an academic. She's a high school teacher, and nor is she, like some of us here tonight, a person who's been involved in this campaign for a very long time, since 2001 or whatever, but is a very recent activist in the campaign. However, she has some very vivid personal experience which I think is useful for us to hear as well.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming. And thanks especially to Senator Sarah Hanson-Young and Professor Desmond Manderson, two great and very passionate speakers. As John said, I'm from the Canberra Refugee Action Committee, and I'm here tonight to tell you about a wonderful man, the father of my children, my husband of 10 years, a man who arrived in Australia as an 18-year-old refugee. Over the next few minutes, I'd like to share with you his story and ask you to think about what it can show us about what's wrong with Tony Abbott's refugee policy. My husband is a very lucky man. He's lucky because when the war began in his country of birth, the former Yugoslavia, he was 13, too young for military service. His father was not so lucky. He was soon conscripted into a war he didn't want, for which he was paid $7 a month. My husband was lucky because he was born and raised in a village. In the village, most of the houses had wells in their yards, so people didn't have to run to the river dodging snipers' bullets to collect water like the residents of Sarajevo did. He was lucky because the villagers had their herds of livestock, their vegetable gardens, their wheat and cornfields. So he didn't have to go hungry looking at empty shelves in the city shops and butcheries. But he was lucky not only because he had all this, but because his people were willing to share. Because in his village, to watch the hardships of your neighbours and be unwilling to help was something shameful to all, and rightly so. He was lucky because despite all the madness around him, his village was governed by an unspoken rule of human solidarity. There was a practical side to this solidarity too. Because the village would often go without electricity for months on end during the fighting, there was no means of refrigerating food, so the villagers took it in turns to slaughter their livestock and divide the meat amongst everyone. This way, they avoided both starvation and waste. My husband was lucky because his people understood the obvious. They understood what the people of Australia also understand, but are being asked by Abbott's government to forget, that on the well-being of our neighbours, our own well-being depends. After almost 4 years of war, the front lines surrounding the enclave, where my husband's people lived as a minority, fell. On that day, my father-in-law was off at the front. When word spread that the front lines had collapsed, panic ensued. In this war, everyone knew, when enclaves were overrun, massacres often followed, as it happened only a month previously in another enclave called Srebrenica. The only chance of survival, everyone said, was to flee before the army arrived. Buses and trucks soon appeared. Everyone was told they had to get out, that those who stayed would die. There was no time to pack anything, not even the family photo albums, no time to arrange passports or visas. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law and the other women and children were allowed onto a bus. My husband, at 17, no longer seen as a child, was not. Alone, he watched his mother and sister flee. But again, my husband was lucky. Even though none of the cars in the village were drivable, they'd been without petrol for years, some of the ancient tractors still had diesel in their tanks. He started up his family's tiny tractor and drove it out of the enclave with more than a dozen other boys and old men hanging on by whatever handholds they could find. He drove all night, and by dawn they were somewhere in the Bosnian mountains. Here, for the first time, he felt that his luck had run out. He was cold and had no spare clothes. He was tired, but with no bed in sight. But worst of all was the sudden realisation that no help would be forthcoming. Everyone he'd once relied on, his parents, his neighbours, his friends, his whole village, was in exactly the same predicament he was. This realisation that his entire support network had collapsed gave him a feeling he can only describe as nakedness, feeling cold, exposed, and embarrassed all at once. This, he guessed, is how it feels to be a refugee. It would be 24 hours before my husband caught up with his mother and sister, far ahead in the refugee column. My mother-in-law tells me she was hysterical the entire time, fearing that the son she'd left behind had been killed. It would be another week before my father-in-law, trapped at the front lines, also found his family, now refugees in a neighbouring country. There, they were allocated floor space in a refugee centre where they would live for the next year. The house that they'd left behind, along with all their possessions, they would soon learn had been confiscated. A stranger now lived rent-free in their home, and there was no prospect of return. Still, in time, my husband came to realise he was still lucky. His family had survived their journey away from the fighting and was still together, unlike many others. And he was also lucky because in that year, in that place, there actually was an Australian embassy within reach and a queue that he could join and so stand a chance of rebuilding all that he had lost. The Australian government had announced they would take several thousand refugees from amongst the millions of displaced people from the former Yugoslavia if they had relatives in Australia who could sponsor them. And my husband had an aunt who'd moved here in the 60s. So then came my husband's biggest stroke of luck. The lucky country lived up to its name and let him in. He couldn't speak much English. He knew next to nothing about Australia, but our country welcomed him in, helped him, and invested in him. Our country allowed him to be a financial burden to it for a short while, to be back in a village that showed the sort of compassion, solidarity, and pragmatism which says, today we help you so that tomorrow you may help us. Our country allowed him to study, to work, to graduate with a doctorate, to pay his taxes, to vote, to marry me, to have his daughters, and to learn to love it. Our country allowed him to contribute to our society's well-being, to display all those virtues we love to call Australian, and so to make this lucky country a little luckier. So what's wrong with Abbott's refugee policy? What's wrong is it leaves those who are naked, naked, and then, as if to hide from the enormity of its own crime, it points a finger at these desperate souls, calling them criminals for daring to come to our shores. By doing so, it leaves our country poorer, not only in millions of taxpayer dollars, but in spirit, humanity, and common sense. But of course, you know all of this. My husband's story isn't here to teach us that. I'm not sharing his story to teach us anything new, really, but simply to remind us of what happens when compassion rather than cruelty is shown to our fellow human beings. To remind us that respect towards our country and its values, which the Abbotts of this world claim these asylum seekers lack, must be earned, and that compassion given is repaid many times over. To remind us that what we do for asylum seekers, we do for ourselves, or that what we do to them, we also do to ourselves. I guess the composers of our Australian national anthem had similar ideas in mind when they wrote our anthem's second verse, a verse obviously either forgotten or never learnt by the creators of Australia's current refugee policy. Because the second half of the second verse goes like this: "For those who've come across the seas, we've boundless plains to share. With courage, let us all combine to advance Australia fair." In closing, I wish Tony Abbott would stop robbing every refugee who comes across the seas today of the chance Australia gave my husband in 1996. Thank you.
It's going to be a long haul that we're involved in here. But I think one of the very important things that we know about campaigns that take a long time to have an impact is it's the role of a vocal minority who stay there making those arguments, keeping the issue out there, presenting an alternative voice, even just objecting to the terms like illegal. All of those kinds of things are critical in the longer term for changing the way this issue plays out in Australia. So I had an experience on Saturday handing out leaflets at the farmers market on the north side for this meeting. A couple of people who came up to me actually, and I thought I must remember that to comment on at this meeting, because the first person said, "Thank you very much for handing out these leaflets, because hardly anyone I know agrees with me about this issue anymore." You know, and the fact that you people make these arguments and it seems sane and logical, where you've got the facts, all of those things are very important. Very important to keep that vocal minority together, I think, even if we recognise that we may be a minority. But the second thing, I think, is a second person came past and said, "Oh, I agree with you completely, but I'm not going to go to the meeting because that'd just be preaching to the converted." I think preaching to the converted is exactly what we've got to do at this time, because what we need to do, by preaching to the converted, we've got to mobilise the converted. And that section of the converted in the Australian population is bigger than you might think, actually. When it's amazing. I looked up the electoral survey figures. The latest ones for 2013 haven't come out, but 2010 came out, and this is an election that was fought about stopping the boats and so on as one of the 4 key issues that Abbott put to it and so on. And this is an issue in which the two major parties have basically agreed on much since at least 2001. And yet, you know, in 2010, 29% of people in Australia either disagreed or disagreed strongly with the idea that the boat should be stopped. 29%, and that seems to me an amazing figure, given that the two major parties, for 90% of the population vote with first preferences, two major parties have had that position for such a long time. The press has hammered us for a long time, by and large, with an anti-refugee position, and yet you've still got a stubborn group inside the Australian population that hold out against it. That means that there's a very significant group for us to work on. And the role of a vocal minority, mobilising that group, I think, can create real pressure and cracks inside the Labor Party, even inside the Liberal Party. There is the possibility, I think, of some progress as a result. And I think, therefore, what we need to do is to turn people who agree with us into activists, trying to turn other people into people who agree with us. So what we want to do, partly with tonight's meeting, is not just to inform people, because I expect most of the people who are here tonight probably agree with this by and large anyway. What we want to do is to appeal to you to use whatever time and talents you have to join the campaign and to help us build it. And there are lots and lots of ways that you can do that. The most obvious is to turn up to this next demonstration outside Parliament House. But don't just do that, and don't just take a leaflet. Take a few leaflets so that you can give them to friends. There are forms outside which aren't just a contact list where you get an email. You can do that if you want. You just get an email to be informed about the events. But also list a whole series of different things that you might be interested in doing in the campaign to help build the campaign. So we appeal to you tonight. First of all, thank you very much for coming. It's been a good and a substantial meeting for our little group to be able to organise, but we appeal to you to stay active with us and to sign those forms outside and tick the appropriate boxes of what you can do into the future, because we need every single one of you to turn this issue around. Finally, let me thank our panellists tonight. I think it's been a great meeting, really interesting discussion. Professor Desmond Manderson, Karen Maric, and of course, Senator Sarah Hanson-Young. Please join me in thanking them.